to welcome everyone to SERI, and we are grateful to have our speaker, Paul Hart, and also Catherine Hart that are visiting us here today. And I want to introduce Jada Kushik, who's a doctoral student here, and she can introduce Paul.
Thank you, Marcia.
And lead us through.
Yes. So we just want to welcome Dr. Hart for joining us today. He's going to be talking about the overall trajectories of the environmental education field. And I just want to start with a short bio about Dr. Hart.
So formal.
About Paul. Paul is a professor of science and environmental education at the University of Regina and an award-winning leader in environmental education. He is an active researcher and serves as one of the executive editors of the Journal of Environmental Education. And his research projects and interests include social learning applied to environmental education, action research, educational research methodology, children's ideas about environment, teacher thinking in environmental education, and legitimation and quality in environmental education research. Paul is the author of numerous articles and books, including Are We There Yet? Deepening Thinking About EE, ESD in Schooling. And for people who aren't in the field, EE is Environmental Education, ESD is Education for Social Development. And that is in the journal, Schooling for Sustainable Development. And he also wrote Environmental Education and Science Education in the Encyclopedia of Science Education. Paul has also edited numerous books, including The Companion to Research and Education and Fields of Green, Restoring Culture, Environment, and Education. So, with Marcia and Jiggling, correct? Is that
Jiggling.
Okay. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Hart.
And I was just thinking, I don't think we'll do a full round of introductions because Paul had a chance to meet most people beforehand, and but it would be nice to know who's out there. So we see we have Susie, Claxton, Tanner, and Troy. Maybe if you guys can just chat where you're based so that we know that, and then if you have a question at any point, just you can let us know by chat, and we'll keep an eye on that, and we can take questions from WebEx as well. So if you guys heard that, if you can just type where you're based, who you are and where you're based, and so that we'll see that information up there.
They can't communicate verbally?
Oh, okay. Thank you. We're learning how this works. There we go.
Oh,
Tanner,
okay.
Yeah, a doctoral student at Stanford Graduate School of Education.
Cool.
Hi, Tanner.
And so Troy and Susie, if you want to do the same, and I believe if you guys unmute, you can actually talk. So if you want to ask a question, and later on we can do that. Thank you.
Just so you know the context of the presentation today, I've been communicating with these folks for a while now, and Jada has been good enough to supply me with a sort of a list of about 8 different questions. And I remember saying to my wife, I think they want me to talk about everything. There's a book about that. It's a theory of everything. And so I lumped some of the things together to try to make sense of what I could do for you today or with you. And so if at the end, if there's any time, hopefully, then if I've missed some things or some things that you happen to be interested in, please feel free to ask questions, and the same for the people who are visiting online. So is that okay? All right. It's nice to see everybody here. It's a small room, but it looks like it's an awfully big crowd when you have a small room. You can't see them all, folks, out there on the...
If you don't mind, I would like Troy just chatted in. He's a PhD student at Virginia Tech School of Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation, working with Dr. Mark Stern. So, welcome, Troy.
Yes. And so what I had the people who were here for lunch do after lunch was to look at some older material, because the first kind of question that I was asked was to talk about a little bit about the history. And I didn't want to bore people with my rendition of history. So I brought some material, some books and materials, some monographs, and some reviews of environmental education research, particularly in the earlier years in the 1970s, into the 80s. And I asked them to talk to me about what they thought they could see in that research. And then I had a second group look at some conference proceedings from those years, so they could tell me what they could see in perhaps the practices, at least those that were being reported at that time, the National Association of Environmental Education Conferences. And it became the North American Association for Environmental Ed. So in the early years, they had a chance to have a look at what kind of research was being done, and also what kind of practice people were exploring, experimenting with, I guess you could say, in their classrooms, and then bringing for scrutiny to these conferences. So maybe someone or the group who were looking at the research reports could maybe tell me what they thought. This is the earliest.
I can start with the research. So I was mainly looking at the 1970s, 1969 all the way to 1976 primarily.
First edition of the Journal of Environmental Ed, which was the only journal at the time, was 1969.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. And primarily, I saw themes surrounding natural and human ecosystems, a lot of work doing that, interpersonal communication, like a lot of themes surrounding communication, person-to-person communication, a lot of work around evaluation. I saw that.
How are we going to evaluate this?
Mm-hmm. And then also a lot of work on attitude behavior, and value in environmental education research.
Good.
The main ones that
I can go next.
Were you looking at research as well?
I was looking at research as well.
From the English?
From Britain.
Yeah.
And a lot of articles in here questioning the purpose of environmental education itself as a field.
Yeah.
Highlight one paper looking at the UNESCO program for environmental education coming out of the UN 1972 Stockholm Conference. The language certainly, gendered male, not yet responsive to feminist critique. Language of balance instead of sustainability, balancing man's relationship to the natural environment. And the word man is used a lot rather than humanity. But also really interesting in its critique of a kind of a perceived focus of research dollars on conferences instead of youth out of school programs. So the researcher was quite interested in directing funding from this program towards youth, EE secondary mostly.
Real stuff on the ground.
Real stuff on the ground, and some actually really interesting kind of critique of cultural imperialism. So there's some kind of progressive strains of the text as well.
Surprising at that time. I think we invented it.
Yeah. There's a line in here: we should condemn the practice of cultural imperialism and the imposition of alien lifestyles through colonialism, industrial and financial exploitation.
Yeah, those people that haven't read the history are condemned to say things that they don't realize other people have been saying.
Mm-hmm. That was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
So that was it for me.
I just have a brief thing to add to the research section, that I think there's a focus sometimes on what are the major environmental concerns that we're tackling, and it's a little bit more of like, ecology and science being talked about themselves and through it, not just the education of it. So there's a focus on natural resources and forestry, conservation, pollution, population, and those kind of preoccupations of really fleshing out what are those concerns.
absolutely, right on. Any other?
I have some questions. I noticed that you had a lot of, you circled down right at the introduction of the Clayshore Field Book about the 5 gross perceptions of the environment. And they included evangelical, economic, aesthetic, athletic was one of them. And but I noticed with a lot of that is, you know, when we look at current models of ESD, education for development, there's a lot of similar pillars. What I also found interesting is there was still that really large sense of fear from a lot of the articles about protecting what we have in that conservation event. And the other last thing I'd say that I found interesting was some of the articles talking about nature places acknowledged a lot of how to integrate special education and disabilities into the environment, which is still something that we're seeing in reading today that people are saying there's a large gap in that area of research.
Yeah, well done. Yeah. There was an apocalyptic group, I think, one of the five,
yeah.
And ecology, I think the apocalyptic group became the deep ecologists. Any others? There were still other people. Did you notice anything different than people said already?
So that was the research. So we did actually, I did the practice part of it. And some of it was also related to like what Kathleen said. There was quite a bit of environment conservation and natural resource management. But also there was a focus on like specific environmental programs that are going on in different neighborhoods, like community gardens and wildlife clubs in different countries. But then there was also the environmental education that was really focused on specific countries, like environmental education in China, environmental education in Brazil, environmental education in certain countries. But there was also a look at what's happening in curriculum and some practical aspects of it, of values and how do we take care of our earth, where are we going to bury our earth when it dies, and how do children learn, and how do we start teaching them about environmental education at that young, early age. Let's see what else here. There was also an aspect of engaging communities, and also about methods as well of environmental education. And yeah. One thing that I noticed, they talked about the wildlife club in Kenya, which I remember in high school, we had a wildlife club in our school and other little agricultural clubs and whatnot. So they talked about different clubs in like high schools and whatnot. So that was something that was kind of interesting. I wasn't a member of that. I know it was. I should have been. I don't remember being a club.
I need an option.
So, yeah.
Any others? Any last?
You guys pretty much covered everything that I noticed. So I kind of went through a lot of the titles, looked for keywords, and see what kinds of keywords popped out, and conservation was definitely one of them. Projects, which kind of goes off of what Naomi was saying. Like there was lots of, like 5 or 6 in one journal of like, you know, this project and that project here and there. So it was very much project-based. And just kind of skimming through some of the abstracts, there were a lot of times the word objective would come out, or total environmental ed for the total, or total environmental ed for the total, I'm getting it wrong now, but yeah, so those are some of my observations.
Okay. And so I'm pleased with what you found, because I went through these materials myself just to refresh my memory on them, and in fact I had lots of these things recorded as well. Environmental education at the time was a strange amalgamation of conservation education, outdoor education. I think I mentioned environmental studies, which was a new kind of field being configured at the time. And I forgot to mention nature study, because there were big nature, especially in some countries, like in England. were hearing disturbing reports from people writing books and speaking in the new media, television, about environmental problems. And so it was almost like some of these organizations were looking for a more significant cause. They needed something to sort of liven up the organizations and really stimulate thinking. Nothing could do this better than. I mean, in the 1970s, there was the same kind of gas, oil, petroleum, fuel problem that we have now. And so it drove a lot of people, because they were living the experience. It drove a lot of them, people to be interested in that. And so ecology was a big factor, and it probably still is. When I read the literature, I see that. Oh, there's critique, obviously. A lot of critique of, I don't know if it's fair or really unfair. I'd have to discuss that more, but I think some of it's unfair, because I think there are basic ecological principles that drive the Earth systems. And I think that's part of the concern for climate change related to these natural cycles. And so environmental education was sort of a wing of science, really, at the time, and outdoor education was part of something else. I think outdoor education sort of partly some outdoor educators wanted to be associated, and other outdoor educators seemed to want to focus more on the health and physical education side, wilderness experience, which is another hope for, I guess, the American Wilderness Society and groups like that. And so there was a lot of concern about this notion, this big word of interdisciplinary. And everyone was trying to figure out, well, what does this mean? Because we have in our schools a particular system, nobody mentioned the word discourse, but we have a system where we have subject area specialists. And so how do we help them make sense of this interdisciplinary, community-based, problem-based, inquiry-based? I'm telling you, inquiry was as popular in the 1970s, and Tim's, as it is now. How do we help people in schools make sense of this interdisciplinary endeavor? And so a lot of the articles, a lot of the activities in schools, a lot of the publications were focused on how do we make sense of this. I told the people who were involved at lunch, or just after lunch, that I think environmental education went through those psychological stages of forming, norming, storming, and performing. And in those early years, in the first decade or so, I'd say environmental education was very much in a forming phase, because we were trying to. There were so many. I mean, there's Noel McInnes's book that people looked at in there. It was called "What Makes Education Environmental." There were all kinds of debates from educators about how can environment, which is like science, be a stimulus or something educational. And if it's interdisciplinary, it's who takes responsibility for it, and nobody really knows how to integrate science and social aspects. And anyway, it was. And so there were issues. I mean, the population issues were talked a lot more about at that time. There were issues of economic equity, and the sustainability people like Chuck Hopkins talked about the fact that we should have a more balanced approach with environment, society, or social aspect. And the third one, the economy. Well, people think that came out of ESD, and it didn't. I mean, if you look at Bill Stapp's original activity manual for environmental education, economics is the #1 concept that they deal with in those manuals. And so it wasn't that economics was being ignored; it was being less privileged, I'd say, and of course that stimulated a lot of debate as well. The research. I have to jump ahead to about 1975 to talk about research, because if you looked at the earliest materials, it was more philosophical. So even in a journal like Environmental Education, it wasn't hardcore empiricist research in the early 70s. It was more philosophical. Coming to look at what kind of philosophical positions or concepts or ideas were driving this new field. Now, once we had Belgrade and Tbilisi in the mid-70s, that seemed to give some force, some governmental force. Although President Nixon of the United States did sign the Environmental Education Act in 1970, the environmental education movement really received stimulus when it became international through UNESCO. And the UNESCO conferences, the United Nations Environment Program under UNESCO, the International Environmental Education Program, where they brought Bill Stapp, one of the most well-known environmental educators, the pioneers, when they asked him to come to Paris and develop that International Environmental Education Program. All those kinds of events meant that governments were paying some attention to these ideas. However concrete or disparate they were in their minds, they knew there was something important here, and whether it was just government rhetoric or not, some turned out to be very much that. After that point in time, though, after the mid-70s, if you start to look at the journals and how they might have evolved, you see a lot more empirical, I would say a better word is empiricist, research was being published. Because many of these people who were environmental education researchers at the time, as distinct from environmental education practitioner people who were really motivated somehow to do this, these researchers had background in science. And the only game in town was quantitative, empiricist-based research. And so they were trying to find a way to contrive studies, and many of them became known subsequently as KAB research. So it's knowledge, attitudes, behavior research. And I remember Clay Schoenfeld, the original editor of the Journal of Environmental Education, and Harold Hungerford, who followed him from Southern Illinois University and was a big proponent, science educator, big proponent of KAB research, probably the most quoted fellow at the time, and probably almost in the time, talking about this notion of the relationship between the more knowledge people have, the more positive their attitudes will be, and therefore their behaviors could possibly change. And the problem was, of course, if you're doing scientific research, you live or you die on the basis of validity and reliability, and the problem was the quality of the instruments and the quality of the samples always plagued educational research. And so, but study after study after study kept coming into the Journal of Environmental Ed to the point where people like Schoenfeld and Hungerford were lamenting the fact that we already know all of this. Why do people keep doing it over and over? It's like insanity. Definition. So there were landmark things happening in the United States and internationally, in Australia, in Great Britain in particular. There were in other countries too, but honestly, many of these other countries were taking their leads from the people who seemed to have the money and the inclination to do this. And so the Outlines of Environmental Education was published, and all kinds of monographs at that time, NAAEE conferences, NAEE and then NAAE. I can't remember the exact date, somewhere around 1978 or so. They became the North American Association for Environmental Ed. The same with the NAA, National Association for Environmental Ed in Britain, and the A squared, E squared, the Australian Association for Environmental Education. All developed organizations, and the field was growing very, very rapidly. And so I characterize the 1980s. I'm just going to move along because I could dwell on that for a long time. Lots of interesting stuff, but only I would be interested in that. And I know that. So, but history, history repeats itself. So Palmer's book in 1998, I'm going to talk about the 80s, but Palmer's book in 1998 captures some of the early history and more recent history at that time, between the 70s and the 90s. And so she talked about a paradox, even in 98. The paradox being that Earth care is urgent, and yet environmental education is marginalized. So in the 1980s into the 90s, I kind of characterized that as a bit of a norming period. We were trying to figure out where we were, and just at that time, the Brundtland report was published, and the WCED, the World Congress on Environment and Development. And the word development was introduced into the language of environmental ed. And then subsequently the word sustainability, sustainable development, environment, education for sustainability, and education for sustainable development. And so, what Cynthia Dillard said, it changed the music so much, the dance. And so the discourse, the language changed. And so we went into a storming period in the practice of environmental education, whether in fact to get rid of the word environment, the words environmental education, and go with education first. There was a backlash. There still is. There's still a big debate going on. And so, there was a kind of a sea change happened in 1984, 85, in that area, where the conferences all became about redefining, sort of almost renorming, and then we started. It became a bit of a firestorm, it seems to me at the time. Anyway. So the consolidation that they talk about in the 1980s was, people were relatively happy, and we were starting to gain some ground. And then the World Conservation Strategy came along, and then Brundtland and Our Common Future, and then the debates started and evolved into the 1990s. And so the Earth Summit at Rio, what was it, 92, the Global Forum, Agenda 21. I have those documents. I looked at them carefully. And for most of us in environmental education, in the field that kept the name environmental education, the NGO forum that ran it parallel to the Earth Summit backstairs, produced 21 principles that were used probably by more environmental educators than the Earth Summit report. Even the Chapter 36, I don't know how many people have ever even looked at Chapter 36 of Agenda 21. It was called Education, Public Awareness, and Training. That's as much mentioned as the word environment together. In the education, in connection with the education side. There are lots of chapters on environment, but those were more science-based. And so along about that time, in 1987, some Australians started writing monographs. And Deakin University was a sort of a hotbed of critical theory. And the critique that started to emerge interested me a great deal, because I thought it was good for the field to have these kinds of sharp, pointed critiques. And so I went there for my first sabbatical in 1988 and worked with critical theorists and with a fellow called Ian Rowbottom at Deakin University. And together we produced a little monograph on environmental education research. And the idea was that I don't want to be too unfair, but I thought that basically all of the research that had been done up to that time, we both did, that was KAV research, was basically useless. It really didn't help the field get anywhere, because they started to do at that time the sophistication of the statistical programs allowed meta-analysis. And the meta-analyses weren't confirming that there was any kind of strong relationship that could be found between knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. Even between knowledge and attitude. The knowledge instruments were probably the best quality instruments. The attitude ones were, I'm not so sure they were very good attitude instruments, although there was lots of debate about that. And behavior was self-reported. So the validity and reliability could be argued were questionable at best. And so we talked about the fact that if you're going to have a paradigm that's related to the environment, it's interdisciplinary, and it's inquiry-based, different than sort of the traditional formal education, and if you want research to investigate that, then perhaps we need different kind of research. And at that time, and I think that the field was a bit insular at the time, and you start to look outside in the field of education, and you look at the evolution of thinking about qualitative research in education, interpretive research, critical research, early stages of feminist post-structural. Feminists contributed probably the most to that critical thought, and so there was a storming period. We really never got well normed before the storms. And that's the way some marriages work too. I said to the group, whether it's a group of 2 or whether it's a group of 4,000, you still have to go through the same kind of, and if you don't get through the storming, you're never going to get the performance. Rudolf Dreikers said, based in Adlerian psychology. So Kathy Nolan and I did an examination of environmental education research in 1999. Peter Posh had done one for the little journal, but one of the best journals in science education, in my opinion, called Studies in Science Education out of England. And he could do the field in 1989, but in 1999, it had grown so quickly in that 90s decade that it was almost impossible. I almost gave up. I don't know how many times because it just proliferated. And I think it proliferated because the issue didn't go away. Of course, environmental education didn't go away, and education for sustainable development just added fuel. And so whether you were sort of, whether the language you used was ESD or environmental ed, I think most environmental educators were pretty generous and expanded their thinking and acknowledged the economy, social side of environment. But there are lots of arguments that lamented the notion that this course was governmental, suspicion of government didn't want to use the word environment, and so it was a convenient way of eliminating that important word from the dialogue. And so we're going to publish a new edition, a special issue of the Journal of Environmental Education that revisits that, because I don't think that debate is over yet. I think we need to talk about that. Anyway, some of the students, some of the people here have read that review of environmental education research in 1999. And so I think what was happening at that time was we were actually immersed in confusion, but we were creating the conditions for change, which sometimes has to come out of that turmoil. And so we were questioning what I think was the ideology of curriculum work in environmental ed and the compliance of environmental education research, how compliant or how critical should it be. And so rather than searching for individualist indicators of behavior change, we started to look more at possibilities for community and group interactional kind of change that might be very important. So curriculum at that time, that was my field at the time, curriculum. And we were looking at this notion of shifting from this research, development, diffusion, adoption model, which was the Tylerian, however you want to define the Tylerian approach to curriculum development. And so I mean, we're trying to keep track of curriculum, we're trying to keep track of research, and we're trying to keep track of the philosophical discussions in the field was a concern. The notion that I like to talk about here is the notion that we were trying to evolve. It's complex. It's very, it is complex. Trying to evolve from the concern, our major concern about changing human behavior to changing the cultural political discourse that itself we thought was unsustainable. So it was the discourse that was the problem, not the individual. I mean, yes, individual change, yeah, recycle, by all means. But if we're not dealing with the political, at the same time we're dealing with the individual, then, I don't know what kind of change can really take place. And so at that same time that Ian Rowbottom and I were writing that little monograph on engaging the debate in environmental education research, John Feen, he was at Griffith University at the time, was writing a little monograph on what I call the worldview monograph, where he was looking at making a distinction between, actually he wasn't a feminist really, and he might have considered himself to be. I don't know, John's a good guy, but Ian Rowbottom and John never spoke to each other after ESD because Ian thought John had sold out to ESD. Little asides. That's what makes it come alive. A little side story. But he was looking at the difference. He's trying to conceptualize the dominant social paradigm, the ones we all grew up in, the ones that came automatic. Same in research. That's what I was looking at in research. That that's what we are. We live the discourse, right? And so this notion that I was always interested in this notion of worldview. I used to call it human nature, but always interested in this idea of worldview. I think it's really crucial to almost anything we do. And so John wrote and talked about the new environmental paradigm. In fact, some industrious empiricists liked this in a way, and they adopted this, what they call the new environment paradigm scale. STAM, I forget the name of the authors of that new environmental paradigm scale. And so, given all of this turmoil, there was another period, what I think is a relatively exciting period of expansion. We've never been able to predict that. But then we had new journals, like the Environmental Education Research was begun in 1995. I would have predicted it was earlier, and the Australian journal goes back to 1985. The Canadian journal, anybody, 96. The Southern African journal was 1984, and the International Journal of Geography and Environment that was 92. And then there was a proliferation of journals with sustainability. So it's just, now there are 25 or 30 fairly active journals. There was an increasing complexity in the field and an increasing diversity of approaches and research within that complexity. So I'm getting toward the year 2000, and after 2000, I have trouble. My memory is going something. It's very complex after the year 2000. I don't know how anybody can really sort it all out. I'd really be glad if a team of people could get together and help sort out what is happening, what has happened since the year 2000. I think there's confusing mixtures. I talked to some of the students at lunchtime about the value of genealogy, trying to sort out EE and ESD. And you start to think about this person's writing this paper, and this person's writing that paper, and where's that all coming? Where's that? Start to look at the genealogy. Who did they study with? sometimes it's meaningful and sometimes it's not necessarily meaningful, like Heidegger and Husserl, you know. It's not necessarily, doesn't always bear out, but sometimes it does, and you can sort of see threads. You know who came out of that Deakin School, and you know who came out of Harold Hungerford's Southern Illinois University School. I don't know, maybe someone could do that kind of thing. But the present, we're trying to, if we go through, forming, norming, storming, we're trying to perform, I think, now. And we're struggling to do that, but we're trying to do that. And I think there's some valiant attempts. So I found a document. I have lots of old documents that I sort of saved. And one of them was a document. It's Marcia's report to the Regional Center of Expertise in Saskatchewan. They had an ESD Conference of the Americas in 2008, and it was about environmental sustainability post development. And it began with a commentary on the 2007 UNESCO ESD or Education Sector Report on drivers and barriers. So other people at the time, not just me, were trying to sort out what was going on after 2000. And about 2007 or 8, they started to look at, okay, so maybe if we can figure out what's going on in this, what's really going on in this complexity, maybe we can make sense of it. Well, what are the drivers? Where are they coming from? And then what are the barriers? What are the blockers? And so I remember speaking at the conference before Marcia, and of course I did a little bit of historical work again at that, and then tried to provide some historical context and some idea of how we evolved to this uncertainty as a result of the Brundtland report. One of the things that Brundtland did was to sort of raise the issue of government, what Foucault or what some of the post-structural theorists might call governmentality, and to start to raise the issue, because that's where we seem to be, the head seems to be hitting the ceiling. You know, that which ship was turned upside down, and people your heads are hitting the ceiling, but we don't know where to go. We don't know how to get out of here. I believe science education's been like that since 1970, by the way. I think they really don't know which direction to go, so they keep doing the same research. Because very few of them, maybe this journal called Cultural Studies in Science Education has a chance. You know, if Michael Roth and who's the guy he studied with, if they could ever get together and agree on things, that journal might have a chance. But there were some valiant attempts. And the Brundtland report did talk about do-nothing government, which we still see today. And so there were some valiant efforts by organizations, like what at least one I thought was very valuable was the document that came out from the World Wildlife Fund in England called was Caring for the Earth. There were explicit strategies in there. There was good critical discussion about the field and about how to move on. And the important contribution that I think Marcia made at that 2007 conference was the focus on starting to refocus on culture. And that really was significant in my mind. I mean, I would remember that without even having discovered that document, because it sort of hit people hard. And other people, I guess, were broaching this at the same time. But I think it really did help have us to begin to cause us to begin to pay attention to what was going on in many other countries and how culture was implicated in all of this. And so I think I remember Marcia's words, something like, when we say ESD, whose knowledge are we talking about? What innovation are we talking about? And in which places? Then we have
kind of depressing. Seems like I should have been taking something different all that many years ago.
So I'm going to, I can move, I'm sure you'll have questions, but you asked me about areas of concern. So I'm not going to sidestep those, and that's what I've been mentioning, as well as the history and into the present. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my assumptions about what I think is going on in the field of education and environment, and the things that resonate with my thinking. And then you can have at me with.
Can I just say welcome to those that have joined us, and if you don't mind muting, unless you're asking a question, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Alan's on. Good.
Yeah.
Hey, Alan. I'm not hearing you. You're not speaking back to us. Good to have you on 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. 30.
Hi.
That's Alan. Hi. So let's talk about let's kind of go through this. So things that resonate with my thinking were that early empiricist research was quite useless, and that instrumentalist KAB relationships, rather than qualitative experiential human-planet relationships, really was an important shift in focus. And so my interest has always been, it moved from attitude. So my master's thesis, if you looked at it in horror, you'd say, well, he's trying to figure this KAB thing out from the point of attitudes, because I thought attitudes were the most important thing. They related to behavior more than knowledge did, surprisingly, in those meta-analyses. And so I moved, I think, from attitudes to something about values, which I thought was much deeper. And then there was a lot of literature on values for a long time. Everybody else seemed to be interested in values as well. And I think the more recent focus on what I like to think of as Catherine's work is on subjectivity or subjectification, how we come to construct ourselves as environmental educators, really is starting to get to the point of what we were all doing way back in the earlier days. And that, to me, relates to an interest that I had 10 or 15 years ago in significant life experience. And Alan will remember that in environmental education research, there was a special issue on significant life experience. And I think it was largely related to the fact that some of the researchers in that area were doing sort of behaviorist kind of research. And it really wasn't addressing the real value of the significant. So even in submissions that probably Alan gets, I haven't seen all of those, but some in JEE are still related to things that are, I think, basically significant life experiences, the value of those early life experiences and how young people came to construct their own identities. So I guess subjectivity, identity work has really become important to me. And so I guess I think that leads to curriculum work in early childhood education. I'm not an early childhood educator, but I think I might do it over, if I had to do it over again, become more interested in that from an environmental education or ESD point of view, because I guess I liked Yuri Bronfenbrenner's work. And David Hutchison wrote a book called Growing Up Green, where they talked about how when people come to construct their functional their functional cosmology of the universe, how they start to connect to the planet. And MJ's work was, in my mind, all about that really complex, fundamental connection. I used to say MJ's work is about how do we learn to love a planet? How do we come to love a planet? And so a lot of sense to me came from MJ's work that tried to take us beyond feminist post-structuralism to more spiritual connections that were valuable things as well. And I can remember MJ, really angry with me several times on the phone.
I never.
And kept saying, you don't get this, you don't get it, you don't. But then at her oral, I've got to say, in my defense, And one of the ladies that she valued most in terms of her communication about this came up to me after the defense, and she said, "You really do get it, don't you?" And I really felt good about that. I still think Marcy doesn't think I get it, but I'll try. So, relocating childhood and learning in the post-human landscape. Interesting. And I think we're thinking in a more complex way about our research now. And I think we have the methodological and methods, tools. I don't like the technological metaphor of tools to help us think in more complex ways. And so this paper in the journal Discourse by Africa Taylor and others, you know this? Marcy is nodding. Reminds me of this connection between Donna Haraway and Noel Goff, and they're talking about, you know, the more than human extend cyborg research. And Africa Taylor and others talk about these bag lady stories or narratives of alternative ways of thinking about the disconnect between children and modernist schooling. Bob Stevenson in 87 and then republished by Alan and Bill Scott in DER that talked about the disconnect between the sort of almost like the environment paradigm and the education paradigm in schooling. I think it was one of the most powerful documents, one of the papers in the field over those years, and Alan and Bill, I think, must have agreed because they published that as one of the key papers in their collection for their, I think it was the anniversary issue of environmental ed research. But the disconnect is the important thing, and so her notion that children live in complex, mixed up worlds of mobilities, diversities, technologies, divides, blurring boundaries. Gosh, to be a child these days, increasing awareness of the interdependencies and hearing about these scary planetary challenges. And so you say to yourself, given all of this complexity, so what is school like? Your man here, Glenn Aiken, had said not too long ago, you go into a biology classroom now and it's like it was in the 1950s. So what is school like? I mean, environmental education, ESD, education for sustainability is crucial. And so I guess I see, as the others I've just mentioned, the Taylor group in that paper, I see as post-humanism and environmentalism, I see them resonating because of, I guess, my own feelings for the connection between humans and, in particular, for me, animals. The connections that the authors are starting to develop that resonate, I guess, around early experiences, early childhood experiences. But that's not enough. And I think part of the problem with the field is that if we're going to deal specifically with those kinds of things that may interest us, we also have to deal with this level that Marcy is working in, of policy. Because for me, that's related to governmentality, and the notion that if we don't somehow figure out a way, and I guess it takes a generation to make a change, at least perhaps if we work in teacher education and in education generally, I think that's where I think we might be able to penetrate government with the kind of people who choose to, I guess, stand for election so that attitudes can change. So what I want to talk to you about my work, my real burning interest would be to look at early childhood as a way of developing subjectivity and subjective and using, I think, techniques to help children think about how they construct their worldview. I like Bronwyn Davies' work that looks at how children come to construct themselves as 1990s that I think tried to penetrate government in a particular way. And so that in the early 90s, I was asked by Saskatchewan Education to develop some background papers for the new Saskatchewan science curriculum. And I told them at the time that maybe they need a team of people, maybe somebody like Glenn Aikenhead from the U of S for a Saskatchewan science curriculum. And my interest was environment. They said, well, we still want you to do it. And so I said, okay. And so this was the time in the United States when there was a big movement called STS, Science Technology Society. It's a movement that hasn't really, it's sort of died out in a way. I think it was taken over, usurped by other things. But at the time, when I started looking at scientific literacy and the dimension of scientific literacy, it seemed to me that environment needed to be there. And so we talked about STSE. And Barry Mitchke, who was an environmental educator in his bones, was in a prominent position in the government, in the Department of Education at the time. And they ran with the proposal, and they had become part of the Pan-Canadian Science Curriculum Development Framework for the country. And at the same time, I was making arguments within the Faculty of Education to try to get environmental education incorporated into teacher education, into the core. And so now at the U of R, it is a core subject, a required subject. And there was lots of debate in the 70s. I know, I can give you part of the history about whether it should be a subject in itself or whether it should be integrated into all. Yes, both. We still have to have it as a subject, whether it can be critiqued or not. And so I tried to work on those fronts because I thought, if we don't. Another one was a fellow named Lau Bancro, some of you know in this room, and Dan Beveridge.
This is his son, by the way.
Who? Are you Lau's son or Dan?
Dan.
Dan. And so we started meeting with the Minister of Environment, who was Buckley Belanger from northern Saskatchewan at the time, and we started to talk about this notion that we need to have environmental education, as a key part of the Department of Environment. And he was with us all the way. But it just shows, you think, well, we're not going to work with all these bureaucrats. We have all kinds of philosophies and ways of not engaging in any of them. Work with the minister. And we want basically two things. We want an environmental education coordinator for the province, and we want a liaison with the school system, or the education department, which we couldn't penetrate, even though I had done the background work for the new Saskatchewan science curriculum. Couldn't penetrate at all. And even Buckley Belanger, who wanted to be on our new, supposedly new Environmental Education Advisory Committee to the province, couldn't penetrate his own bureaucracy. And so we faced all kinds of problems within the Department of Environment at that time. I actually, between my master's and my PhD, worked for the Department of Environment, Saskatchewan Environment, for a year, and was basically told that if I kept working on the lines that I was, that I might not be working there next month, because we started to make some pretty heavy noises with the bureaucrats. And so I think I learned some valuable lessons about working both on that Saskatchewan science curriculum, about government and the Department of Environment, about working with government. So that's what interests me about Marcia's project on policy, because I think, while we need to address environmental education throughout the school system, as we always have been trying to do, we can't be naive about having to address policy area issues. But it's the people the people who develop the policies that I think are the ones that we need to work with. And that's where the blocks seem to be occurring. I was on the committee of a fellow called Paul Colliner at on his committee at UBC, his doctoral committee. And Paul was interested in starting to look at discourse. And he read Foucault for 5 years, and many others as well. But he wanted to do a Foucauldian analysis of the discourse that was operating in power companies who were claiming to be green. And his dissertation talks about his analysis of the discourse of power corporations, another aspect of government, what we call the corporation or not. And so he actually resigned from his position, but he was actually in the department that was generating the brochures that would come out with your bills, your Saskatchewan power bills, about how green this company was. And we had one of the dirtiest coal mining operations in the country, probably in the Estevan coal fields, because I worked on with one of my supervisors. I worked on her PhD with her on spill pile vegetation reclamation in Estevan during her late 1970s. And so it's complex. It's very complex, but I think you have to work it. We have to have people, and that's what's dynamic about this field right now. We have to have people working at all levels and in all areas. And this is a gap. The reason I think it's important, but Marcia's work and your work here as students is important, is because it relates to government and it relates to policy. I hope it relates to government, but it certainly relates to policy. I don't know where else it could relate. I don't know what else it could relate to if it wasn't relating to the policy makers. And so, how are we doing for time? Take a breath.
Yeah. Would you like to take a little break now?
No.
Or? Okay. I just saw the time. Oh, it's 3:40. We have about 20 more minutes.
Okay. Maybe I should stop a bit before then, so that we can get maybe one question.
That's great.
We can go a bit over too if people need to leave, and people can stay. We'll keep going.
So they asked me to talk a little bit about the most difficult problem they gave me, and that was to deal with sort of futures. And I said to Marcy on the phone, I said, well, what do you think? I don't know. I think there's lots of excellent research being done that really interests me right now about possibilities, future possibilities. And so let me see how I can do this in a fairly concise way. I think there are certain kinds of activities that are happening that they're related to social and educational critiques that need to continue. And it's always fascinated, interests me, but it has to be turned into action as well. And I understand that. And that will lead new living conditions. Maxine Green talked about actions that can lead to what she called material conditions that have the potential to change young people's intersubjective world. And so these kinds of so I'm going to just talk about what I think might be important. One, in terms of I'm speaking to Marcia's student group primarily. I've got a diverse audience, but I look at my task as talking to the group of people that are working with Marcia here at CEFN. That's what is paying my $10 to come here. If I can extract $10 from Marcia, you know what I'm talking about. I think one of the most strategic things that we can do is something that I've valued in my whole career in environmental ed, and that's developing alliances with the people I like to work with and I respect, and I like to read their work. We might have differences, but we value each other's contributions. And so working your way into, it's one of the biggest things that Marcia can do for you by bringing you together in this research conglomerate, is to start forming alliances and going to conferences and starting to go to the session, introduce your goals to the people whose ideas you like. And so, because the issues are so complex, I think they really are. multiple ecology. So I don't mind the word ecology, about body, home, and place. I like reading material that I think relates to the global, local, breaking the binary of global, local. And I think working internationally or working on a large scale, even though it costs in pollution dollars or however you want to label them, this international work gives you power, more power at home. And if we're talking about power, and we have to recognize what's happening here in terms of the way discourse, power, and knowledge operate, you need to take advantage of the possibility of international alliances that might give you more power at home. And so another thing might be to work across scales. That's why I was interested in subjectivity, individual subjectivity, and at the same time, governmentality. Because I think you have to be involved, across all of those levels. And the best advice I can ever give to any of my students is to read, and read more, and read widely, and continuously, and find your areas that you're really passionate about, and then find alliances among people who are passionate about those same things. Sounds a bit motherhoodish, but I really do believe it's important, so I said it. There, I did. And explore multiple theoretical perspectives. I don't just read in environmental education, and I don't just read in educational research. I read much more widely than that. I remember Alan 10 years ago encouraging people in environmental education to publish outside environmental education or sustainability education journals, and to engage the ideas of people who are working outside environmental education, because I think that also, there are so many great journals. I have a pile of them in there. I was going to trot them. I was going to start throwing them up. You know that video, the Robbie Coltrane video, where he's asked to give one I use in my research methods classes. So Robbie Coltrane is Haggard in the big guy in the Harry Potter movie, and he played a forensic psychologist. In a British documentary, a British show called Cracker, and so he was the guy that was brought into the difficult crime scenes to talk the hostage taker out of killing his hostages. And so a philosophy professor invited him. He was a PhD in I guess forensic psychology. Give a lecture in the lecture hall about philosophy, about how he came to understand himself through philosophy. And he went up to the video shows it's the first issue. It's the first Cracker episode, if you wanted to find it. And he stands up in front of them, and he has a whole pile of books on the lectern. And they are, Leibniz and Spinoza and all of the Hume and all of the great philosophers. And he takes the books one at a time, and he fires them at the class. He throws them, and I guess the psychology comes into it a bit. I don't know. He said, if you want to know anything, or if you want to make a contribution, the first thing you do is go and lock yourself away for 3 or 4 days by yourself. He said in a room, I'd say somewhere outdoors, and get to know yourself. Really get to know yourself, and then you can, and then you might have the possibility of picking up one of these books and having it maybe make some sense. So I guess that the notion is that you need to know, and have a serious commitment to what you really want to be. Honestly, I think one of the most prominent, if if it isn't looking at subjectivity and subjectification processes, I think Foucault called it subjectivization. Doesn't matter how you come to construct yourself. I think if you can focus on that, which is part of what Robbie Coltrane was really talking about when he was throwing the books at the people, and then if you can combine that with a really critical look at discourse. I mean, whether it's critical discourse analysis, I know there's lots of pros and cons, or Foucauldian analysis, which looks at meta-discourses. I think that's just beginning to give us maybe some of the fodder that we need to keep moving this field along. And so I think that has lots of potential myself. And so I guess there's power in both local case studies, if you really get passionate about it. You did some work with students in in British Columbia. Okay, so I think that local, really passionate work with people is really, really valuable, but I don't think it's valuable without the policy government side as well, as I think I've said several times. And so I guess I'd say from there's this guy named Ian Stronach, who I like it. He used to be at Manchester Metropolitan University. Maybe Ian even knows Ian Stronach. He's at John Liverpool's University now. And Liverpool, John Moores, I guess they call it. And he's what I call a critical or post-structural educator. And then a fellow that Philip Payne from Australia introduced me to called Ingolfin Bluethoff, who writes about post-ecologist politics, social theory, and the abdication of the ecologist paradigm. Each of these people, if you start to read, keep reading, each of these people, for me, emphasizes the false promise of empiricism, but much an old song now, perhaps, but strongly advocate for a post-social or post-ecological research paradigm. And I'll never get to do it, probably in my career, but qualitative research has started a renaissance in the educational social research realm, and following these new materialists and new feminist materialists who are bringing the concrete back in. I think there's lots of potential for work on the ground, work related to policy, but also work related to the field of advancing theory in education. And I think that's about all. I don't know what more I could say. That's how I feel.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Well, so now we would like to open it up to questions. Anyone in the room or even online?
I have a question. You talked about in the 1970s that the preoccupation with people were trying to sense of that. Could you say a little bit more about what sense they made of it, and possibly in terms of, it's been an ongoing issue with their education, right? How do we teach people how to teach?
There were heavy debates in the 1970s about interdisciplinarity. They mainly, I think, were related to another argument. Another argument was, should environmental education be a subject area like science, or should it be infused into all subject areas? That's the approach they sort of had to interdisciplinarity. Then the notion that there are powerful ideas that can penetrate from the different from the perspectives of the different disciplines, discipline to open up to ideas or concepts that might in themselves, almost by definition, be interdisciplinary. We might be able to make some ground, we might be able to gain some ground in having people work in a crossing area like borderland area like environmental education. There were many arguments at the time that students or young people going through school need to know something about the content, the structure of the discipline before they can adequately engage in cross-disciplinary things or interdisciplinary. There was another one too, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary. Thank you. And I guess because my background was through the disciplines, I sort of thought there was something to that. I sort of felt like I sort of feel like with my daughter studying medicine, but I'm really glad she understands anatomy. I'm really glad she understands physiology. I'm glad, I guess, but I may be wrong. And I'm really fascinated by people who are trying to show me that I'm wrong. And I don't know if it's just right or wrong or just shades of gray. I don't know.
Would these debates happen in teacher education as well?
Yeah, where we could engage teacher educators who didn't want to just do the same old lectures that they've done for 20 years and stay within biology education or chemistry. I mean, we merged in UR, we merged biology, chemistry, and physics into sort of secondary science. In fact, when they asked me to do that background work for the Department of Education, I recommended that the sciences in the high schools be amalgamated, that we don't study biology. And now, I guess in Saskatchewan, we're moving a little bit away from it. It takes time, it takes generations of thinking. And so I'm really encouraged to see the environmental side, environmental science, and then is it geological science or physical science or health? And so it takes a while. And so I guess my impatience or our impatience as we came through this field, I guess my doctor used to say to me, how bad do things have to get before you're counting? For my 10-year annual. If I don't go every year now, my doctor says you go to another doctor. My age. Yeah.
Well, the same tensions that exist in our college aspect, and it existed in fact education,
Yeah.
as you mentioned. And it is,
I mean, try to.
Yeah. And I was there when Paul was writing all this stuff, and it was tough, but like you said, it's neither maybe binary in ways. You can do all of it, and it's complex. Yeah. And it's, because there are realities like chemistry. What can kids do to investigate things? Well, there's safety issues. So they need those to basic things. But on the other hand, why would they bother? That's the motivational thing. Why bother? I mean, and so that's where you go into the bigger pictures, like bigger questions. That's still really alive, that tension.
Yeah, and I guess the part of the tension was how much do people have to know about the discipline? How much content knowledge, how much skills they need to have this discipline. I mean, I think things are changing. I think I was listening at 4:30 this morning to an Australian Research Council presentation that related to that whether randomized controlled trials in medicine were in fact the best way to study cancer, certain kinds of cancer. They were talking specifically more, I think, of the pancreatic cancer and brain cancer, two of the most complex and devastating cancers. And we're talking about the notion that randomized controlled trials weren't helpful. knowledge of the gene switches, and the notion that perhaps individual genomes, and looking at comparing, doing detailed studies of individuals, which sounds to me, of course, I'm thinking qualitative research. We do specific studies on individuals in small groups. It's important to, and it's interesting that they're starting things in particularly sticky places, because that's one of those types of cancers are the most difficult to understand. And so they're trying different strategies, trying different methods, not even methodologies yet, but methods. And I don't know, Jim. That's how much anatomy do you remember? 20 years after you took your anatomy course, and how much do you need to?
There's a question. There's a question online. I can read it out there. Probably
from Alan.
Or do they want to
you can
speak
see
it?
who said it. I don't know if it was Hannah maybe, but.
Yeah, it's from Alan. Alan, do you want to just speak?
He said his connection has been spotty.
Oh,
So maybe
okay.
that's why.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Do you want to read it then, John?
Just read it out for people.
Okay.
Maybe. Everybody can't see the screen.
Yes. Thanks, Paul. I guess my question arising from today, and I have had a spotty connectivity, so apologies if I missed this a bit, is can people in the field craft historical accounts that aren't, how do you say that? What's professionalist?
Yeah.
I've never heard of that term. In both the sense of what does or doesn't succeed and what follows one after the other. In other words, where chronology isn't the organizing frame, it is mainly a reflection on the International Handbook of Research in EE Contributions. You understand that?
Be part, of course, for Alan May's question. If not.
Yeah, Alan always asks good, challenging questions. They're the best questions I get. One of the things that, I was looking at the International Handbook, and I wasn't thinking of it as a chronology. I was thinking of it more holistically. When I looked at the chapters, many of you have looked at that probably. I see Marcia's copy is almost worn out. But it seemed to me, I made a whole page of notes on the handbook, and it seemed to me that I don't know how to answer that question. That's a really difficult one for me to answer. But I know that the handbook for me did different things than any other history that I don't think it can be construed as historical, although there are papers in there, one by Annette Goff, and the one by, well, of course, Bob Stevenson looks at it somewhat historically. But it seemed to me that what they did was they crossed over between historical, curriculum, assessment or naming, framing, and doing, and then philosophical perspective. It seemed to me that was a way of illustrating probably maybe the value and at the same time the disadvantage of looking at the evolution of the field chronologically. I think that the handbook is quite a good piece of work that allows you to look at non-historically, but at the same time, it's not cast as an historical document. But at the same time, it gives you a feeling for the evolution of ideas that might be more important than, say, the sort of the chronological year by year, the kind of maybe the history that Joy Palmer wrote in the 98 and in the 98 book. I think there's some merit to the way the handbook was constructed in taking us out of the strict kind of chronology, and I still think there's value in that. But I also think there's value in sort of moving beyond that. And I think that's what the handbook maybe as a step might have helped us to do. And I don't know whether that really answers Alan's question because,
sorry, I was just going to say, like, it seems like from what Annette's article, what she tries to point out is that the history that she tries to provide is sort of from a genealogical perspective, that it's trying to situate some of what we're seeing in terms of the diversity within the field today, rather than just sort of an account step by step through what has happened. And I get the sense from what's in the handbook that there's a lot of sort of parallel because of the sort of the different sections, the parallels that things that are happening at the same time, the different directions that or different interests that people have within the field. So it's not necessarily a chronology. It's sort of trying to give an overview, and there is some sort of history to it, but it's not sort of purely from start to finish years.
It's still a solidification of any accounting is, even if it's not set up as a chronology. But I had a related. My question was on this history because I was intrigued by your comment that maybe a group of people should get together and review a history because I do direct people still to that Joy Palmer book, but it's almost 20 years out of date. And I hadn't thought of it until you were talking. I was thinking about
what to do now.
But when we were working on Filthy Green, I remember asking you about, I wanted to write the intro as a history, and you guys were just having nothing to do with that. So I was interested that,
whether just wanting me to do that too, and I'm not going.
Things are less because it's too political, right? Yeah. But I think it is needed, and it was so wonderful to hear you speak about it today. Thank you.
Yeah, that's why I think your own reading is important. The politics are always going to get you. You can't be the critique in the field is how the field grows. It's inevitable, and you have to live with that. But you have to go with what you really believe. I mean, look at what MJ did. I mean, we in MJ's dissertation, which was a poetic hypertext, we had to rewrite the graduate studies manual for the university in order for her dissertation to be accepted, and we did it. I mean, it didn't accommodate this kind of thinking. It didn't accommodate the kind of representation that she was trying to capture. And so there's real value in reading and widely and proceeding to do the kind of good work that you're beginning to do in spite of the institution, the structure, the discourse.
Do we have any other questions? Maybe one more question before we end?
And I don't honestly know. I mean, I feel humble in a way. I was at an executive council meeting a week ago, Wednesday. Our university and most post-secondary institutions in this country are in severe difficulty right now. And, I have the vision of the president of the university. I'm not saying who, I'm not saying what universities, but standing up and really asking for help, not knowing which direction to turn. And in some ways, sometimes in the middle of the night, I feel that way. But then I know that I've got wonderful papers to read. And what gets me going again are some of the wonderful, stimulating ideas that people are generating. The literature beyond environmental education. There are so many. I have a list of about 75 or 80 journals that I look at all the time, and I just can't wait to get at the next paper, because it's not for what the paper says necessarily, but for what it. And then I start writing. It causes me to think about things that I feel, that this helped me jump the gap between sort of not being able to, being caught up in this, I don't know what to do, and getting out there and starting to generate ideas in areas that you think might have potential.
I have a very practical question stemming from that. What's your reading and writing practice like? We've been talking about that over the last.
Ask Catherine. She works.
She texts me at 3:30 in the morning. Something that he's read.
I think Alan's like that. I think many of the people that I really enjoy talking to and working with in the field are people that just love ideas, and they love working, and they love asking critical questions. And it's what?
I like sleeping.
I do.
And then you read through
And
the
I won't file them until, yeah, you know, there are two kinds of people, filers and pilers. Well, they know me as a filer, but I won't file that thing until I read it. You know, I have that many files because I'll never get through. Now, I'm reaching the stage where I know I'll never get through them all before I'm done.
Next slide.
Yeah. She can start reading them.
Do we have a question from online?
Everybody's left.
The format changed.
Yeah, something changed. Shannon, are you trying to join us?
He can't say.
What happened to our, maybe the chat window just closed there.
Did you have a limited amount of time?
Oh. Oh, recording. Yeah. I think it's just the chat window closed. Doesn't look like anyone else. No other questions or comments from online? Any others in the room?
Yeah.
I looked over, 2003, the teachers' environmental education thinking, environmental education teachers thinking.
The one in here?
The chapter book. Your book.
Oh, yeah.
How would you?
The 2003.
Was it 2003? What year?
I was wondering about the date. Which one is your teacher thinking? What year was that?
Oh, 2005.
2005. How do you see that? What was the follow-up after that? And I wonder, what would you have added?
Yeah, I still have more to do.
Yeah.
You see, I work with teachers right across the country, and I worked. You saw chapter. Is it chapter 3 or chapter 4?
I looked more the.
It's the one that juxtaposes the teachers' ideas with David Orr and some of the kind of the key philosophical people in environmental ed. One of the messages I give to my students when I'm working on research methodology and methods is, this business of the power of relationships. I've heard this from Marcy already today. That's the key. And so these people's ideas. I mean, they say teachers don't have theories. That's what I'd say to that. We all have theories. We just always bring them up on the table for in full view on call. But these teachers' ideas are really powerful and really strong. I asked many teachers about why they teach science education, and they really can't say much more than it's in the curriculum. But you ask them about something that wasn't in the curriculum at the time, but that they really believed young kids needed to be educated about, and they were so passionate. Their philosophy is probably every bit as deep as some of these so-called known global thinkers on environmental education. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at or not. The follow-up was related to children's ideas, and I haven't got a book out yet on that. And so we talked to many children, many of them children of these teachers that you met in that book, and that the ideas that they have as a result of the experiences they had in school, some people will say are really powerful. Other critics might say that they're sort of indoctrination. I mean, I think as kids just learn to develop and learn to think for themselves, if they ever do in school, then they'll come to the conclusions that they think are important as a result of all of their schooling, not just part of it. But these kids' ideas about environment, at least at the time or shortly after they had these experiences, I think were really very powerful as well. So then I tried to look at how the third study was, how to try to put this together and how to look at the connection between teacher thinking and children's ideas. It's a very difficult thing to do, but the relationships, it seems to me, are like a genealogy, because the language, I guess, the language betrays the concepts or the ideas. and depending on how sophisticated they can get about articulating, I see connection. It was worthwhile. I think the government was well served by the Marcy is on the SSHRC adjudication committee. I didn't put in a grant application.
Paul was really hoping you guys would be here, so thanks for coming.
Yeah,
and Shannon's hiding around the corner. Any comments or questions?
Any question for Catherine or Paul?
Yeah.
Out there. I was wondering if one of you could speak to the kind of history and role of narrative inquiry in environmental education research.
I don't know, but wouldn't pretend to know what the history sort of within the field of environmental education per se.
Well, one of the things that I've tried to do is I've tried to introduce environmental educators to, let alone, to qualitative work. And I teach courses that are qualitative research courses, like our 80-10 class, our master's level courses, a class in qualitative research methodology and method. And it's really interesting because we're a product of the dominant perspective. What's in our head about research is empiricist-based, no matter what they say. And the interesting thing for me is that narrative inquiry sometimes is one of the most powerful ways of having people start to think differently about what is knowledge, what counts. Mm-hmm. What counts as evidence, what counts as knowledge, what counts as research. So we talk about, I guess I don't know whether it's the best work or not, but I like Donald Polkinghorne's work and Jerome Bruner's work, not on narrative inquiry, but on notions of narrative as epistemology, narrative ways of knowing. That's hard for people to get their heads around. And so I guess what I'm going to do for the rest, what I've been trying to do for the last few years and what I want to continue to do is show people the value of methodologies like narrative inquiry in trying to understand answer some of the questions, or get at some of the issues or ideas that relate to people's thinking about environment or their understanding of and the value of what kind of knowledge we're trying to do.
And I guess I would say that sort of, rather than sort of looking at narrative in environmental education, what I've looked at in terms of narrative has been narrative inquiry, narrative research, and narrative in relation to identity.
Right.
Because obviously I'm looking at environmental identity, but looking at the connection between narrative and identity, because that's one of the big focus areas.
And what I focus on is okay, so students have a question. The question is the most important thing. I mean, I'm not anti-positivist. Post-positivist is different than anti-positivist. And so I think it depends on the question you're asking, always. And so if you have a question that lends itself to people being able to understand something for themselves better or more deeply from engaging in storytelling with others, I think that there's real power in it. And so I guess that's what I think environmental educators could do more effectively about reporting on what happens in their classrooms when they're working with kids, or outdoors when they're working with their kids.
I see Alan just has a comment here. It's following on Andrew's comment, the poet Shaman Haney in Weighing In 1996 looks at the challenging notion of the power of power not exercised.
Yeah.
Is that a feature of teacher narrative, particularly when it comes to enacting?
That's not a question. It's rhetorical. It's very good. It's very good. Yes. Very good. Wonderful. Yep. Brilliant. They say anything good. Alan in Australia.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt. I did have a question after Marcia prompted, but I'm just wondering in the field what you're seeing in terms of reviewing the different journals and actually reviewing.
I'm glad you're asking. Alan's still online, maybe.
Oh,
no,
yeah, great.
Yeah,
but around notions of subjectivity around power, around discourse, and early childhood and the way that kids are coming to understand themselves in the world in relation to ecology and so forth. Are you seeing proposals around looking at how youth are at the same time coming to understand themselves as ecological beings and at the same time raced or classed or gendered and so forth?
I have to go to those journals in order to see that. You know,
but not necessarily in environment.
Not yet. They're not there yet. And that's one of the reasons I go to conferences and try to speak passionately about research in other fields or other areas like race, class, gender, geography, ageism, those kinds of things that because we're not getting submissions. Alan has a couple of recent ones recently that he asked me to review, which are starting to turn the corner. I'm really excited about that. You know, there were 2 papers that he sent me recently to have a look at. Each one of them, I think, has a great deal of. Maybe we're just starting. It takes a while, but maybe we're just starting to see environmental educators. Some environmental educators working, or ESD people working in SERI. Because if you can see what I see.
So, what's the history of that? Because I was interested when I was. So, sorry, can I just? Oh, so
yes, it is, Alan. Absolutely.
So to read for everyone.
Yes.
Damn WebEx people.
Would be nice if you buy one.
He says, isn't that partly why we did the contextualizing section in the companion, which marked the contextualizing researchers?
The problem is they're not marketing that companion properly. They've got to get a soft cover, or they've got to do something to market it better. It's invisible in the field. I don't know what's wrong with it.
That's what it's on the shelf here.
Yeah, I saw it on the shelf. I thought, oh, there's one out there somewhere. Yeah, they're not marketing it very well, but I think there's lots of material in there for. Yeah.
What was I going to say?
I have no idea.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, I was just going to ask you about the history of that, because I was interested when I was in Australia to see, and I should remember her name, but they had an issue of, a retrospective issue of the Australian Journal of Environmental Ed, and I'm sure one of you remembers her name, but this woman back in the 80s wrote this fabulous, thank you,
She worked with Ian Roebuck.
I've never seen it before.
It's in there now, the paper's right in there, and I brought it up. Yeah, it is.
So, I mean, that's just one example, and there has been other work, there has been other work sort of across the decades, but, what's happening, like, I know sometimes people come to meetings and then they go away, and I don't know, we have a section of the handbook called the margins, right, and that's where issues of gender and race and class are positioned, right, so, to what extent, what can be done to open that up, and to what extent is that, a problem of the field, or is it just that researchers aren't doing that work, or are they doing it but they're publishing it elsewhere?
I don't know if the researchers in environmental ed read widely enough to see the parallelism. There are lots of studies. Related to race, in these other journals. That they're direct parallels to environmental education. We're a marginalized field, the same as they feel marginalized for race, gender, place. I'm from Regina. Immediately, place comes into it. You're from where?
I guess just to ask, for all of us what we can do to make more space for that work and we're researchers doing it themselves.
I think our journals, like, EER and AJEE and JEE, so we're not just open for that kind of. We're trying to encourage it. So when we have these journal editors meetings, I think they're somewhat important meetings at conferences where people can come and listen to us, try to encourage people to read more widely and submit articles that are related to these parallel, intersectional issues.
Didn't CJEE relatively recently have an indigenous, like a special issue that had indigenous, bringing in indigenous perspectives or indigenous, or research informed using an indigenous perspective, which I think is sort of a start to.
It's one of the sections in the class that I work in, indigenous research perspective and decolonizing research perspective.
I think there's a special issue there on margins as well. Alan says the challenge is to not just see this by a special issue.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think that's an example where we're starting to see it, and maybe rather than it just being a special issue, it would then start to move into being a little bit more mainstream.
I think some of the special issues have been good at alerting people to pay attention to this, but I think the idea is that it should catch on and become regular articles.
It's tricky though.
If any of you are capable of doing it, submit papers to both of them.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting even with the special issue thing. Like I know when we submitted the special issue to ER on Indigenous people and post-colonial, it was like about half the editorial board wasn't in support, right? And because Alan was the editor, and listens the other half that it got in, I think. And
we have people in government. Those are the kind of people we need in government that will make those strategic decisions, in spite of the fact that they're always going to have opposition from other courts. Where's it? Okay, educational leadership is a contradiction in terms. Where's the leadership? I'm serious. Where is the leadership? Where is the leadership? Nobody wants to be dean at our faculty.
Get your head chopped off. Keep it low.
But if you read our mission statement, if you look at, you wonder why. That's exactly what you said.
Any other questions?
Yeah, maybe just getting your comment. I was going to talk about indigeneity, and that kind of connection, but maybe just give me your comments. I'm interested in the latest push for STEM and its relation to environmental ed and sustainability education. And just how you think about that, because I
honestly can't answer that.
No? Okay.
I really don't see it. I really don't see the connection. Somebody needs to write a paper that helps me understand that.
There is a woman out of, I'll have to find out. She actually was at the CSSC in Korea, and her PhD was on a political analysis of where STEM came from, which is not educational. It comes out of
discourse analysis or political?
A mix, probably. Yeah. But she's reviewed all the documents in the Bush era, and that's where it comes from. Yeah. It's not an educational undertaking. Yeah. To focus on. It's really interesting.
Maybe that's why I sort of. It's a little naive.
But now I keep getting tapped on that because of that. But anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Were you going to say one more thing?
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming. Can everyone please help me join together and say thank you guys for